is to make the keyword out of it. And lastly, you need to just search in the search databases. So we're going to start with making inclusion and exclusion criteria. Yeah, sorry. So firstly, these are some of the criteria that can be used either for inclusion or exclusion criteria. So if you're writing a systematic review, then you need to include this in your method. But if you're writing a narrative literature review, that would be optional. Usually if it's added, it will only be like a short paragraph. And what can be used is firstly date. So by date here, I mean date of publication. So as we know that research has been done for a long time, and sometimes the research article from the 1950s is no longer relevant to us. Why the publication is important. Yep. And okay, so for example, well, we usually don't include the 1950s article anymore. Usually we only include the most relevant articles for now. So it's usually between 5 to 10 years. But of course, you can also include all articles, especially if the topic is new, like gene therapy is a very new topic. So usually, even if you don't cut the publication date range, the latest one would not be past 20 years. So you can just include all the publications. And the next one is exposure of interest. It's basically what is studied by the article. So it's related to your topic. So for example, if we're doing a research about gene therapy, then it should be about gene therapy, but then it should also be clear what the gene therapy is used for. So for Angelman syndrome, then it's gene therapy for Angelman syndrome, something like that. So you don't want to include, for example, gene therapy for HIV because it doesn't really correspond to the topic. And then there's also geographic location. So sometimes some articles, some topic has already been discussed for a certain geographic area, but not for others. For example, I made a systematic review about the factors associated with preeclampsia, that is a disease in pregnant women. So that factors is well defined in the Western region, but not in the Asian countries. So I make the review article be specific. What I want to know is maternal factors associated with preeclampsia in Asian women. With that, then it increases the novelty of my literature review. You can further specify it to a certain region. So for example, it's not Asia, but Southeast Asia, or not Africa, but West Africa. You can also include only a certain country, for example, as long as the country has more than one original articles about it. Because, well, our main sources is the articles. So if the articles are not enough, then we cannot write like a comprehensive analysis about it. And the next one is language. Language is more related to our limitations. So of course we cannot speak our languages in the world. So what we can do is to only include the languages that we know. So if you take a look at the inclusion and exclusion criteria of an article, it's usually language are in English or in other language that you can speak of. So for example, me, I can speak Indonesian, so language should be in English or Indonesian. But sometimes you don't find the articles in your own language, and that's okay too. You can just write it as your inclusion or exclusion criteria. And then the next part is the participants. So this is also another way to increase your novelty and to raise your chance to getting accepted to a prestigious journal, because, well, some topics can affect different set of participants differently. So for example, climate change, it affects women disproportionately compared to men. So we can further focus our literature review to only focus on women. Other things that we can tweak on to increase the novelty of our review article is to look at the demography aside of gender. So you can also take a look at the age. For example, perhaps a pneumonia or asthma is more relevant for younger children, although not always. So you can write about young children, and then you can focus on teenager or adults, or you can also, of course, always include all of them as well. And then you can also focus on the ethnicities, etc. So basically, you can choose who do you want to get in your literature review by focusing on this participant criteria. And the next part is peer review. So has anyone here ever heard of peer review? So if you know, please write in the chat box. So basically, peer review is about like a quality control of the journal article before it got published. So for each article that got submitted, the article is further read by researchers to ensure its credibility. So usually in review articles, we only include peer-reviewed articles because we want to ensure that it's credible. And yeah, the next step is reported outcomes. So it's also an important part of it. Well, actually, it's not only an important part for research review, but also original research if you're interested in holding one. So what outcome would you like to know? For example, if you're going back to the gene therapy for Angelman syndrome example, maybe what we want to know is its efficiency or its ability to cure, or its ability to decrease the number of comorbidities, something like that. And yeah, so it's very important to be explained in an inclusion and exclusion criteria. And the next part is setting. It can also be used for novelty. So for example, if you're looking for the outcomes of stroke, it can differ between settings. Maybe in hospitals, in rural areas compared to in urban areas, the outcome will be better in the urban areas because they have more facilities, something like that. It can also be about hospitals versus clinics, for example, or hospitals versus facilities in rural areas, or telemedicine. There are a lot of settings in this medical world that you can use. Something like that. And the next part is study design. So I think it was covered in the previous part. There are a lot of study designs, cross-sectional, cohort. So each has different different reasons on why is it held, and it has different abilities to showcase a topic, so it needs to be defined. So I will explain about it in the next slide. I think it has a better table to illustrate it. And lastly, type of publication. So if you see in journal articles, there are a lot of type of publications. It can be review articles, original research, commentary, letter to editors, something like that. Sometimes a review article can be assigned as a letter to the editor. And so it's up to you whether to add it or not. But usually in type of publications, we only include original research articles, something. And then, so these are the examples. So this is from my own review article that was published. So in the inclusion criteria, what I include is a peer review study that focuses on the molecular dilations. Well, basically, this is the definition of Angelman syndrome. And also the language, what I use is English, Greek, Ukrainian, and Indonesian, because we have participants from and researchers from Greece, Ukraine, and Indonesia, and also India. And well, it was not written here, but it should be peer-reviewed studies that focus on Angelman syndrome and gene therapy, because we want to write about gene therapy as well. And oh, I forgot about this. So sometimes the full text is not available in the database. So for example, if you're looking for articles, sometimes the article only has the abstract visible for us. And no matter what you do, you cannot access the full text. So usually it's not included, because only by reading the full text can we truly analyze the article as well as critically appraising it. And then as for the exclusion, you can exclude studies that acknowledge a conflict of interest. So, well, because gene therapy is still a very new topic, and sometimes there are conflict of interest in it. So we want to ensure that our review is as objective as possible. And one way to do that is to exclude articles that acknowledge a conflict of interest. And then the next part is about the outcomes and more detail. So if you're writing especially about medicine, it should be preferably patient-oriented. So you can see here, for example, if you're writing about a drug, then you better focus on the impact and the improvement of patients rather than the impact of it on the lab situation or on the ECG, for example. Because what we want is to improve the condition of the patients, not only the numbers. Sometimes, even though the numbers are increased or the numbers are becoming better, it actually doesn't show similar clinical improvement in patients. So for the outcomes, always prefer patient-oriented outcomes. And then, yeah, this is another inclusion and exclusion criteria for more global health related topic. So, yeah, for example, here's peer-reviewed studies that focus on climate change and health. And I also included some information about participants and the setting. So I want to focus on women and gender and low to middle income countries. And then it should also further be explained what lower and middle income countries are defined. So usually what we use is World Bank classification, and then you can also include the language and whether the full text is available. And for the exclusion criteria, it can be similar to the previous one. And then the next part is about the study design. So each type of topic can have different study design that best describe it. For example, for therapy, the best one is RCT, or randomized controlled trial, because at randomized controlled trial, you usually compare a drug, for example, a therapy with another thing that has been the gold standard of it. And it has a very robust study design that usually reduce the chance of bias, something like that. So for therapy, RCT is the best one. For prognosis, it's best to look for cohort, because cohort usually follows the journey of the patient from start to finish, either prospectively or retrospectively. And of course, prospectively is better because it once again reduces the possibility of bias. And in diagnosis, cohort is also better. And in I don't think it's only cohort. Outside of cohort, it's also cross-sectional, because well, in diagnosis, sometimes you take the data for one time only. So cross-sectional is usually one time taking data. And so that should be your priority for choosing the right study design. So the next step is to know your database. Where are you going to search for the articles? So these are some of the databases that are usually used. So do you know any other medical databases? If you know, please write in the chat box. And are you familiar with the databases here? Like PubMed, Embase, Cochrane Library, etc. I need to also clarify that EBSCOhosts usually have similar article with PubMed, because PubMed contains database called Medline and Sinahu. I'm not sure how to read that, but it's like a dentistry database. And EBSCOhosts also contain that. So if you choose databases, if you're already using PubMed, perhaps you can prioritize EBSCOhost last. So usually in review articles, you don't only search in one database. You need to write that you search at least in two or three databases. Like I usually myself use PubMed and Scopus. Scopus is another research database, and also Cochrane Library, but you can always use other databases. And Google Scholar is actually very good at identifying articles that are published in national journals that are not usually indexed in PubMed and EBSCOhost or other indexing here. Yeah. Thank you for the answers. So yeah, PubMed and NCBI, I think and Google Scholar as well. I think those are the most usually used database. So, but you can always check out other databases as well, like Embase. They also have comprehensive articles list that you can look into. And in a review article, you can actually add studies that you don't find in the database after you search for it, but you know it's relevant to your topic. So for example, perhaps a show in Google, but not in Google Scholar. So you can include that as long as it's a research article and of course not a news article or something like that. Basically, it should be in accordance to the search criteria, inclusion and exclusion criteria. And you can also add studies from the references of the study that are in PubMed. For example, about climate change and health, perhaps the article that you find in PubMed have a reference that has not been included in any of these databases, then you can include that. So in looking for articles, preferably you should always look for the reference section of each article you're using, because sometimes there are some new articles that you can't find in it. And for doing a database search, you need to use MeSH terms or medical subject headings, which I will explain in the next part, and also Boolean operators. So it's something like this. So if you look in the research articles, you sometimes find keywords section under the abstract section. And in the keywords section, well, usually the term used there is like a codified one, the one that is usually standardized, and the standardization is used by the standardized version used is the MeSH terms or medical subject headings. So it's made by NCBI. So you can go into this link and search for any topic that you want to do a literature review on. For example, here, I want to search about gene therapy. So it turns out that the medical subject heading terms is the genetic therapy. So you can use this for your search. And if you enter this term or other of these terms, for example, you can also search gene therapy. Other article that use a different type of keyword, for example, the NA therapy, will also be included in your search. So if you're using a mesh term, then it will help you to get more article and make your search be more comprehensive. So you can always not use the mesh terms, but it's not really recommended because we want to get as comprehensive as possible. If we go back to the literature review definition, it's that we want to summarize the literature in the database. So we want to make our search as comprehensive as possible. And then the next part is the Boolean operator. So yeah, it's something like this. So there's and, or, and not. So this is a Venn diagram. For example, if you're writing genetic therapy and Engelmann syndrome, then only article with both words will be included. If you use or, then articles using both words, either of those words, would be included. And lastly, if you write not, then articles with this word will not be included. And this is the result of the search with Boolean operators in PubMed. So with these keywords, something like this. But usually you don't write not review, because sometimes even in articles, like original review articles, they write something about review there, like the word review should be there. So usually in PubMed, what you do is you can just click that you don't want to include review articles. I think it's in the advanced search. And then after you search the articles, what you need to do is you need to select the articles. And this is where the inclusion and exclusion criteria comes in handy, of course. But I have some tips as well. Sometimes when we search the articles, because we want to be as comprehensive as possible, the article would be very many, like 300 articles in one search. So that can be overwhelming. And so what you need to do is that, firstly, of course, you need to read the title. If the title is not relevant to your topic, then you don't need to include it. If you're unsure, then you can always read the abstract first before downloading the full text article. And you need to also be objective. So if you have researched about it before, about a certain topic before, of course, you can include it in your review. It increases our citation and our credibility as a researcher at that, because, well, citation is one of the parameters of a researcher, but you need to be objective. If it is not relevant, then don't include it. And since we will be doing appraisal, assessing the quality of the paper later, you need to also be objective in assessing your research. So that's like the tricky part of including your research into your review. And you need to be up to date, but do not forget older studies, especially if your criteria does not have the publication date range, because sometimes it's also still relevant. And like I've mentioned before, the ideal number of articles differs between the types of reviews. So it will be 80 for mini review and more than 100 for full-length reviews. And the next part is critical appraisal. So if you have any questions, you can directly write in the chat box and I will try to address it after the presentation. I hope I'm clear up until the part 3. So now we're going to the next part, that is critical appraisal. Critical appraisal is basically, well, it's like us assessing the quality of a paper. So we want to know if it's trustworthy or not, if it's filled with bias or not, and if it's relevant to our topic. And there are some ways to do it. You can do it in your own way if it's narrative literature review, because there's no guideline on how to do it in narrative literature review, but always look for the methods, because methods are how data are collected. And if we find faults in that, then we can have reasonable doubt about whether it's trustworthy and without bias or not. For example, if there is no blinding, if the researcher knows the participants of the data they were taking, then that can increase the risk of bias. You can also look into some tools, but this is compulsory only for systematic review articles. So I think this question is from, well, I forget the tool for this. Yeah, but these are some questions that can help you. Usually the tools that are used for systematic review is firstly Cochrane risk of bias tool, and also well, each type of study design have different tools. For example, for cohort, you can use the STROBE scoring, or STROBE, or for cross-sectional or for cohort and other observational studies and RCT, I think there's also Newcastle Ottawa scale. So you can look into it for more. So usually they comprise of these types of questions that you can directly use to evaluate a paper. So yeah, it's actually quite simple, but you need to be objective, and it's sometimes a lot of work. For example, the STROBE scoring have 22 questions. So if you have 10 articles included, then of course, well, that's a lot of things. And I mentioned that it needs to have, a review needs to have 80 references. So it's basically for more for narrative review. For systematic review, you can include as little as 3 articles. So it's totally fine. But because the strong point of systematic review is that you appraise the articles. So you want it to have a robust method. So you don't need to include as many as the narrative review articles, which focuses more on summarizing the current articles. Yeah, and critical appraisal, you also need to know the parts of a research article. So what title should consist of: abstract, introduction, methods, results, discussion, and conclusion. So these are the common parts of a research article. Sometimes results and discussion are together, and it's okay as long as the contents are still in accordance to what results and discussion should be. So for example, I think this slides explain this pretty clearly, but what you need to look for critical appraisal is particularly the methods part, like I mentioned. How do they do the data collection? How do they do the statistical analysis? Are the participants blinded? Are the researchers blinded as well? By blinding, I mean, like, do they know the name of the participants, or are the name removed for statistical analysis, something like that? And then sample size also can skew the result of an article. So if it's smaller, then it may perhaps not be generalizable. And results should also be clear. And in the discussion, usually the limitations of the study is explained, like, for example, the small study, sample size, etc. So you can look into this as well. So this is a part of articles, like article title, abstract keywords, introduction, and like the one I mentioned, results and discussion are sometimes together. Yeah, and you should always look into conflict of interest as well. So, and this is the tools I explained before. So I think you can look into it more by searching critical appraisal tools if you're interested to learn more about it. And the next part, after you appraise and assess the quality of the papers you included, is to extract the data. So usually I do this at the same time. So at the same time, I'm appraising the article, I also extract the data because it's faster that way. As with appraisal, I need to also read the article. And for data extraction, it's best to